And welcome back to exercise 3. What we're going to be looking at here in this exercise is we're going to be taking a look at how we deal with planning out multiple shapes. So let's bring in our bridge here and let's start with frame 1. There we go. And I'm just going to create a new session up here, 25 frames a second, and we will call this bridge 001. And again, we'll only have the Roto node turned on just for the time being. Hit F to fit us in, and let's just cache this in and take a quick look at what it is we really want to do. Cool, I'm really going to get a slightly challenging shot here. What I want to do is I want to start breaking this scene up into its various component parts. So you could be asked to do this for any number of particular effects, including creating depth maps for certain filters or maybe 2D to 3D conversion. But let's take a little look about what we're going to do to actually break this up here. We've got, actually I'm going to bring in a new node. And I'm going to just bring in the paint node here just so we can actually draw stuff on it. So before I can even start doing that, let's just save this out. Cool, so let's mark out some of these places. So the first thing we're going to do is want to take out this area here, which is our sort of front sign. We're also going to be taking out this bit of wood over here, and we'll also need a mat eventually for our water going on here as well. So what's going to be the best strategy for getting all of these shapes out in the simplest way possible? Because if we start to, just sort of cut each one of these out individually, we could be really duplicating a lot of work that we don't need to do. So I'm going to propose we do this. We take one shape out for the water, one giant shape, which I can't draw on, but one giant shape for the water. We then take another shape that does our wood down here, and we take a third shape that does the sign down here. So by doing that, we actually have a couple of different advantages. Now, one of them is we don't have to keep recreating shapes that we've already created. So this is going to speed things up quite a lot. The other advantage we have is that we know that our shapes are going to be accurate and consistent. So if we did, for example, let's move us on to another one here. If we did try to make an exact shape for this wood bit here, and a completely different exact shape for this bit of the railing here, there's nothing to say that these are going to be matching up, pixel perfectly or sub-pixel perfectly. So we could end up with a little bit of a join here. But we know that if we plan our strategy out correctly, that we're going to have a proper pixel perfect match between these two shapes, because we'll have used ones that we've created to enhance the other ones. Cool. Actually, I'm going to get rid of my my paint node now. I don't need that. So let's come back into my settings, remove my paint node, and save this properly. All right. So let's get going. Generally, I like to work from the background up to the foreground. So the stuff that's in behind. So say, for example, the water. Let's do that. Let's zoom out a little bit and reshape this. So I'm going to make this big and rather inaccurate, but that's fine. Just needs to be big and blobby. All right. So so the water is at the back. It's behind all the other stuff here. So I'd create that first and have that in the back. I'm going to show you a very good habit to get into. We looked at this and we touched on this in the last exercise, but that is grouping your layers up. So I'm going to add another layer group here. And I'm just going to call this water, and let's call this water square. So this is basically our main water here, and drag that inside. So when we come to later objects that are slightly more complicated, we don't have to deal with hundreds of shapes. We can just sort of collapse things together into their respective groups. Now the next thing we're going to look at is our wood here. So let's just zoom into our wood, and we'll take a quick look. I'm only going to do actually probably the first 30 frames of this. So if I come back to my settings here, Let's change the duration back from 75 to 30 and just take a look at that. And this is probably a good time as any to take a quick look down here. At the moment I've got my play set to loop, which means that when I get to the end of my clip, it loops back to the beginning. We have the option of changing it to swing all once. Once just plays through and then stops, and swing will sort of ping pong between the beginning and the end. Now I actually prefer doing it this way because it allows me to check the integrity of the mask quite readily. Okay, so let's take a look at this. What I want to do is I want to start all of our shapes at the most complex point that I can do. So the bit where we see the most detail, that's probably going to be here. So let's create a new layer up here and we'll call it wood. And just as before, we're going to be creating a number of small, simpler shapes. It's not going to be a huge help in this particular shot because this shot is just, well, it's so short and the perspective shift isn't all that great. So we're not really seeing different edges of the shape, but it's just a good habit, healthy habit to get into. And we'll just use our X-spline. One thing just to mention here, if you've still got, let's go back into our preferences, we've still got your picking tolerance set up to 20 as we had it in the last exercise. It's probably a good idea now to bring this down just for the time being. When we're creating our little shapes here, we want to have that picking tolerance set fairly low. So let's zoom in just a little bit here, make sure we're in our X-spline there, and let's create our little shape. Cool, so I've got the first bit of wood here. So I can right click on any of these clips here and change them to corner point if I need them to be a bit sharper. At any point we can also add points to our individual shape just by holding down the Alt key and clicking, and that will create a new shape for us. So let's come in and we'll just corner these up as well. Cool, and remember, another way of doing the corner is to Alt and drag on there. Alright, so that's our first shape. Let's do our other shapes really quickly as well. Good thing is we can be fairly loose when we know that we've got a bit of an overlap. And it's very important that we have that overlap to make sure that we don't have any little holes poking out, because that would be bad. And we'll do our final one here. Using as few control points as possible, just because, going back to rule number 1, do as little work as possible. The reasoning behind that is it's far easier to control a smaller number of control points than it is a huge and unwieldy number. Cool, so let's just corner that up and spread that out. There we go. Cool, so now we have our little shape. Let's turn our overlay on, and actually let's turn our water off because that's showing a weird thing there. There we go, so we've got our little shape there. Now we could name these splines here as well. We could name them, for example, this one would be left, center, and right. Great, and as before, what we're going to do is we're going to be now animating the camera movement out using not the individual sort of shapes, but we're going to be using our main layer here. So make sure we have our wood selected, come over to our transform mode, and let's change this up. So we'll do the same as we did before. We'll come in, let's just zoom in just a tiny bit. And it's at this stage where I might want to just bring my picking tolerance up a little bit so that I can get my control points where I need them to be. Cool, and put that into the center, roughly into the center there. And let's come to our transform and turn on animation on position, scale, and rotation. Now this is a proper handheld shot. This is there's no control going on here at all. It's quite a tricky little thing to be following, but what we're doing is we're using the same technique as we did last time, and that's just checking out for the part where the either the speed changes or the direction of the shot changes, and just adding keyframes there. Let's open up our little timeline here in the wood, just so we can see those keyframes happening. That's probably going to be there before it starts changing direction again. We will be looking at automated techniques in a slightly later exercise. I think this might actually be even in the next exercise, where we can take out a lot of this pain here, because this is quite a lot of stuff to do, because the shots just are moving so rapidly. Cool, and I think that's good enough for now. It's good enough for what we need it to do. Maybe let's just add another one in here. So you can see we've actually had to add a whole load of keyframes in here. But the bright side of that is we've only had to do that for the main layer, rather than for each individual shape there, which would have been a lot more annoying. Cool, so that's the wood sorted out. Let's come in and now look at what we're going to do with this post here. What's it called? It's called a railing, that's what it's called. Okay, so let's lock our wood, turn the visibility off on that, and create a new layer, and we will call this railings. And as always, we're going to look for the most complex part of the shot here, the one which is going to cause us the most problems, and I'd say it's probably going to be there, actually on the first frame, where we can see most of the details. So let's think about how we're going to break this up into a whole bunch of simple shapes. Now we could take one shape for the top part of the railing, another shape for this bit here, and then for the letters and for the bottom part of the railing, but there's actually a simpler way as well, which you might have guessed so far, is to again create another big square, much bigger than the frame that we're going to be using, and the reason for that is that it moves out a little bit before it moves back, so we can afford to be generous here, and that matches that up there, and that's pretty good there as well. And then instead of adding lots and lots of small masks, what we're going to be doing in this instance is we're going to be taking away instead. We're going to be subtracting those. So again, let's use our square to come in. I'm just going to create a little square there. It pops us right back to our reshape tool. So I can come in here and just stretch those over there. Now this is a time where we do want to start to rename things pretty quickly. Railings main, because this is the full square here, and this next one here I will be calling railings top 1, because it's going to be the first of these shapes from the left, and I like counting from the left. Let's take a look here. So instead of adding to the mask, what we want to do is subtract from it. So we just click on our blend mode there, and that cycles through to subtract. And we'll do the same for the next one as well. So we'll just come in, draw a quick square, bring that in there. And this is going to be railings top 2, subtract, and we've got another little one here as well. What I'm going to do with that is actually just copy and paste this here, so I can Apple or Control C, Apple and Control V, and that pastes another copy for me. So I can just transform this along. Might make it a bit smaller there. There we go. And of course I would repeat this Let's paste that one more time. So Apple V or Control V. Let's come to our reshape here, and we'll bring this one down to the bottom here. So we can quickly start building up this shape here. And this is going to be railings bottom one. Cool, well that's it for now. You get the idea of what we're trying to do. Cool, so let's come in and we'll start to animate this up. Now again, this is where we are going to start transforming it on the layer itself. So come into our transform and let's find a good anchor point. Now we could try and anchor point it in the center. Actually that wouldn't be a bad idea, but let's try and anchor point it from one of the edges here. Just something where I know I can get a bit of a grip on what's going on. Cool, we've got the same thing as we did with the wood. The only other thing that we're going to get is actually there's going to be a bigger shift in perspective because this object is going to be a lot further towards us. So we're going to have to do a lot more moves than we did before. So let's come to our first frame, add our keyframes back into the position, scale and rotate. Now actually before I get going here, I've just take another look through the footage. And when it comes to anchor points, it's going to be quite tricky to keep this one consistent because it actually is going to disappear out fairly soon. So what I am going to do is maybe just move the anchor point to here instead. Just this area here so that I know that I've got a sort of safe area that I'm looking at when I start to move this through. So it's going to move out a little bit. There we go. So I can bring that back there and I know now that I have to rotate it a little bit and scale up just a little bit as well. Now the further layer of complexity that's put on this is also the fact that we're not just dealing with a straight scale, position and rotation shift. We've also got to deal with, let's take us to where we got the final frame of where our anchor point is. Let's bring that down there. Yeah, so we've actually got a sort of distortion going on, which is pretty much like the one that we were able to deal with the corner pin or the distort. We don't have that distort available to us in the same way directly within the layer view. Might just turn off the things here so I can see a bit more of a unobstructed view. And when it has gone out of frame, that's when we'll just shift everything out of frame here. Cool. Let's hit F to fit that back in. And take a quick look through. Now it's not perfect yet, far from it. We've got a few bits still where we definitely have some work to do. We'll quickly come in. Let's just open this up a little bit. But before I get too bogged down in that, I want to show you another couple of things that we haven't looked at yet. Let's come out of transform mode and turn my overlays back off. Now now we'll just zoom in just a tiny bit here. Now one of the things we haven't looked at is how we deal with slightly out of focus objects. So this area here, this is slightly soft, slightly out of focus. So what we can do is we can come in here and on a shape by shape basis, we can come in and blur things up. And we'll just look at it in the black and white alpha channel view, come to our railings main, because that'll show it quite nicely. And we can just blur things up here. Now we have a choice of how our blur works, and I'm going to use Railing's top 1 as a better example. So at the moment we're getting just a sort of standard blur that's blurring from the center, so it's blurring inwards and outwards at the same time. We can have an inner blur which just blurs inwards, so it eats away at the shape we have, or an outer blur which expands the shape that we had before. We also have shrink and grow, so we can take the same shape we've got and just kind of shrink it in a little bit and add a sort of softer border there. We can do that on a shape by shape basis, or we can do that to the layer as well. What have I got here on my Railing's top? Let's just hit this button on the right hand side. That's my reset button there. Cool. Yeah, we can also do this across the entire layer here. And again, set that to blur inner, outer or centered. I'm going to keep centered on just for the time being. Now, one of the nice things we've got is we have repeated functionality across certain windows. So we don't always have to hunt around when we want to do something that's quite important. For example, change the blend mode from add to subtract, multiply, difference. We can do that both up in the object window here, and as we've seen before, down here in our object list. And we can just cycle through those instead. And it goes the same with the invert as well. We can turn the invert on up here or down here. It doesn't matter where we do it. It will update in both windows. So let's take one more look at the footage, because there's one more type of blur that I want to show you, and that's something that we've and we can't have a discussion of blur without looking at motion blur. So when the camera starts moving really fast, we start getting a lot of motion blur going on here. So this is and in this particular shot, there's actually quite a good deal of motion blur to deal with. We actually have a whole exercise coming up later talking about different strategies with motion blur, but we'll take a quick look at it right now, because one of it is about turning motion blur on in the shapes itself and letting silhouette effects render out that motion blur. So if I turn my overlays back on, actually let's turn the overlays off and turn the alpha channel back on here. If I turn my motion blur on all of our shapes here, let's have a look at it here, and I'm going to turn the go to my layer here and turn the blur down to 0 so you can see this a bit better. So we've got motion blur turned on our individual shapes, and yet we're still seeing this pin sharp matte going on here. The reason for this is that we have to turn motion blur on in two places, because it is a little bit processor intensive, or at least it was in the past. You wouldn't want to have your computer chugging away, rendering out motion blur until you really needed to see it. Luckily, computer got a lot faster, so we can come into our node here, and this is also contextual, so it shows you lots of different stuff when the different nodes up here, and we can come into motion blur and turn motion blur on there, and you can already see now that we have a huge difference going on in our shape, and that's rendering out the motion blur really nicely. So where things are moving fast, we get a whole load of motion blur. Where things are staying still, we hardly get any motion blur. Motion blur itself comes with a few controls. We have the shutter angle, the shutter phase, and the samples. And the default settings here are actually really good for most of your general work. If I turn the shutter angle up, you can see the amount of blur is actually getting greater. So shutter angle is shorthand for the amount of motion blur going in. 180 is actually the default setting for a regular camera, so that's the one that's going to match your shot most of the time. The shutter phase here determines where the samples are being taken from, so where is it going to start blurring from. So So if I take this to 0, it's only going to start to sample frames in the future. It's not going to look at any of the frames beforehand. And as I take this back, the further in time it starts to take those samples. And the same if I move this forward here. The general rule of thumb is that it should be minus half your shutter angle here. So if we've got a shutter angle of 360, our shutter phase should be minus 180. And this means it's going to take our current frame as our sort of base white frame here and sample from both the future and the past. And this will get us a very nice effect here. And really help hide any of the slight imperfections I might have. And saying let's add a little bit of our blur here because we've still got a bit of blur going on. And let's take a look at our matte now. Cool, so you can see it's blurred up and motion blurred up. Cool, let's just pop us back and pop us back here. Okay, so now what we want to do is we want to take out these individual layers here. So we can take a look at our composite, we can take a look at our output here, which is going to be the output that we're going to be taking out. So in this case we can render out the active node. We'll take out the all of the range from 1 to 30. We can change what the format is going to be. I'm going to just change this to JPEG just to create small files just for this sake here. And we just want to take out the alpha channel here only. And we can decide where we want to take it out using this here. And we'll give it a file name as well. We'll call this bridge 001. And then as it's an image sequence here, we get to decide what the image number starts with. In this case, it's going to start with 1. Padding, that's how many numbers we're going to have, how many frames it's going to eventually take out. I'm just going to need 3 here because we're not going to go up to high numbers. And the prefix of dot here, we can change this to a hyphen if we want to. So let's hit render on that. And then bringing that into After Effects or any of our compositing apps, we can just see that we've got we have our black and white alpha channel here, which we can pretty much do whatever we want to do with it. For example, let's come in and we'll do what sort of effect will we do? And we'll put an effect on this just so you can see that it's actually doing something. And we'll set the track matte to Luma there. And that's working out fine. We can just screen that over just to make sure that's working fine. Cool. All right, so back into Silhouette Effects, and we'll take out our wood now. So let's turn the wood back on here. At the moment the wood's looking a little bit sharp, especially in comparison to our railing. So let's turn on the motion blur on there. We don't have to do anything else because the motion blur is already turned on in the main node. And now what I want to do is I want to chop off this bit of the railing from our wood. This is where the layer order and the blend modes really start to sort of pay off. So if we flick through the blend modes here, if I turn subtract on our railings, it's now going to take out that. Now the only thing we might get is where we have 2 grey bits meeting here in our compositing app. If we don't tell it to add the alpha channels together, we might end up with a bit of a line there, which is not really what we want. In this instance, something we could do to get around that is turn off the motion blur on the railings here and turn down the blur as well. So this area is a little bit sharper. And because the railings are going to be in front, let's turn that back on there. Our effect is going to be minimal anyway. Cool, alright, so once I'm ready to do that, we can then take out our railings as a separate thing using the exact same So we'll call this bridge wood 001. Everything else is going to be the same. Let's render that out. And the final thing is just the water, and I don't even think we've done anything with the water here. So it covers the range. I'll be absolutely shocked. It's not going to, is it? Because we need to animate all this up, but I don't think we'll do that. So let's just bring the wood back into After Effects. Of course, let's turn our adjustment layer back on. So, let's do exactly the same with this one. Cool, well, that's, it's not a pretty effect, but it shows you that shapes we're taking out are actually working. We're going to leave it there for now. So in this exercise, we looked at analysing the shot and building our scene up from the back to the front here, so we could reuse different parts from other shapes in our final output. What we also did is take another step forward into taking a look at how we build up our certain shapes here. For example, creating small, simple shapes and then using the main layer here to move those around and transform those. We also took a quick look at how we'd use blur and the motion blur as well. In exercise 4, we're going to get our hands on motion trackers. So all of the times I've had to lay down loads and loads of keyframes because of our shaky camera, we're going to be getting rid of that level of human interaction, because the more we can get silhouette doing, the better it is for us, because the more accurate we can be. So the less interaction that we have creating our masks, generally the better it's going to be for the overall result. Cool, but that's all coming up in exercise 4, and I will see you then.